Leonardo DiCaprio.
Miss Anne Hathaway.
Meryl Streep, the Iron Lady.
Alan Arkin in Little Miss Sunshine.
Kevin Costner.
Yes. The King's Speech.
Birdman.
I'm Connor Rold, and welcome back to another episode of Redoing the Oscars. And this week we're going to be looking at the 2010 Oscars year, the final year of the 2010s, to talk about the infamous Best Picture race between The Social Network and The King's Speech, and why I think maybe The Social Network would have been the correct nominated pick. But if you're new to the series, welcome. What I've been doing every single week is going year by year throughout the Oscars, week by week, going backwards and talking about three things. First, what movie or performance I would have given the Oscar to instead of the alternative winner. Talk about a performance or a movie that wasn't even nominated at all that I think should get nominated, and then trying to understand, did the Academy get it right? Less so from a personal opinion and more so from like a historical, objective point of view. It's just fun for us to kind of go back and see individual categories, which ones we would change, which ones we would redo with the hindsight now of 15 plus years. And I've been having a lot of fun with these series. You guys have been enjoying the episodes as well, and you've been really great in terms of sharing your thoughts, so please do continue to do that. Let me know in the comments down below, what are your personal opinions for which of the categories of the Oscars would you have gone a little bit differently? Maybe you would have done a different supporting actress winner, let's say, this year. Love to hear that in the comments down below, as well as some potential unnominated picks. One of my favorite parts of this series is to talk about movies that aren't always considered in the Oscars, but are still, looking back on it, some of the best movies of the year. We talked about just last week why I think Kristen Wiig should have been nominated, and Bridesmaids is of course an iconic, legendary film. They're now just doing a 15-year anniversary re-release in theaters for that film, and they're not doing that with something like The Iron Lady. So sometimes, in that hindsight, it's also really fun to talk about and keep in mind as well. But without all that out of the way, let's start off with what we do in every single episode, which is the context of the 2010 Oscars. This was the kind of King's Speech Oscars and was, I think, a sign of what the Oscars could have been. They did go into a bit of a lull period, I think, in the maybe mid-2010s. But in this period, you had just the second year since the Oscars had expanded their lineup from 5 movies to 10. That's notable because you get movies like Toy Story 3, the first one of the first animated movies to ever get nominated for Best Picture. And when they expanded that lineup to 10, not only were we seeing more blockbuster type movies get nominated for Best Picture, but also animated movies. And that's kind of fallen off. Toy Story 3 was actually the most recent animated feature to be nominated for Best Picture. But at the time then, when they expanded that lineup, we started to see more interesting movies, I think, show up in Best Picture. With a movie like Inception, I don't know if it would have been nominated had the lineup only been 5 movies, but overall the lineup I think is strong, whether that be Toy Story 3, which is a beloved classic, or Inception, or even a movie like Black Swan, which had an IMAX re-release for its anniversary just last year. These are movies that have lasted the test of time, and even the actors that won, like a Natalie Portman or a Christian Bale, are still headlining movies and are well-respected actors, and I think both of them are actors who people, for the most part, are glad to have won Oscars for. They have some sometimes questionable taste as actors, both of them, but they're always good with their performances, and I think that's undeniable for sure. And it's so weird that The King's Speech ultimately did win Best Picture with a lineup of so many great kind of notable films. So we can't talk too much about the Oscars context without talking about my pick. So let's get into that now. My alternative nominated pick that I think should have won Best Picture is The Social Network, as mentioned in the title of this video. I mentioned at the top that this is an infamous win just because The King's Speech is such a kind of middling movie that doesn't have the same reputation and legacy, I think, as The Social Network. Undoubtedly, The Social Network is going to be remembered, I think, as probably the better movie, but also I think as one of the best movies of the 21st century, of the 2010s. when 2020 was around and all these news outlets were doing the best movies of the 2010s, it did seem like Social Network and Parasite were among the consensus amongst a lot of serious critics. And I even when we think of top movies of the 21st century, The Social Network usually is quite high. The fact that it's getting a sequel is indicative that the movie still lingers in the culture, that studio execs thought that it was a good idea to release a sequel. And this is not to say that The King's Speech is one of the worst Best Picture winners of all time. There have been many other worse films than this movie. The issue with The King's Speech ultimately is that it had to beat up The Social Network, which I do think is one of the premier films, not only of its year, but of the decade. But that The King's Speech just doesn't have an intense fan base. If we take a look at, let's say, 2016, if La La Land won then, I think a lot of people would say Moonlight was the better film. Moonlight is a little bit more critically acclaimed when we think about these top 10 lists and things like that. But La La Land has serious fans, and I think people still really appreciate a movie like La La Land. You could even say something like this past year with One Battle After Another. Maybe Sinners is a more well-known movie 20 years from now. But One Battle still has the connection with Paul Thomas Anderson. People aren't going to be, super upset 20 years from now that Paul Thomas Anderson won a Best Picture award. Versus with The King's Speech, it is this kind of a weird situation where it's a entertaining drama, motivational, inspirational, but maybe doesn't have the kind of legacy that even at the time we knew it probably wouldn't have. And what I think is so fascinating about this year is that we almost got it right. This isn't a situation like something like 1999, in which The Matrix wasn't even nominated, and yet today it's seen as one of the premier films of that year. This was a real race going into the Oscars. Now, The King's Speech was the heavy favorite. It won BAFTA, Picture, and PGA, and even DGA. That being said, David Fincher won Best Director at BAFTA. The film won for Best Critics' Choice Award. So there was a little bit of momentum there. It was a possibility, which what I think makes this race so much more frustrating is because The Social Network was nominated. It was a contender. It could have won. It just didn't. But that's what I wanted to talk about today. Not necessarily the race, but the merits of the film itself, which I do think is a great film in part because it is, I think, thematically rich, both in terms of just like a core themes point of view. It's very Shakespearean and a tale of power and jealousy and friendship, but it also feels very modern and current because it's about this social media age, which is developed in our lives, and it feels like a very 21st century kind of a movie because it's dealing with this idea of social media, which didn't exist back in the 20th century, and how that impacts our lives. And I think it's only become more and more relevant as the years gone on, which is kind of a rare thing that Fincher was able to kind of capture what he thinks this is going to happen, and then was ultimately correct in how it took over our lives, really. But it's also pop. It's not a movie that feels serious and slow and like a slog to get through, but don't worry, it's really rewarding. It's an easy recommend because it's a tight 2 hours. It moves fast. People talk fast. There's some great lines. It's very entertaining. Going from one scene to the next, we have this sense of momentum and rhythm, which the movie is so great at. And there's no one part that is out of line. Excellent performances, excellent cinematography. If you just kind of go checklist by checklist, if you're a film fan like that, it checks all the boxes. And we can talk about the editing or Fincher's point of view and contrasting with Sorkin's kind of optimism and the balance that brings there. But what I wanted to talk about in this episode, because you can talk about so many different elements of The Social Network, it's that thematically rich and deep, but on the most recent rewatch, what really stood out to me was Andrew Garfield and his performance. And on one hand, you can go, oh, well, of course Garfield stood out to you, Connor. He's the most successful actor probably from this film. Now, looking at it, 15 years later, of course, he's the one that stood out. But I also think that some people really appreciate Jesse Eisenberg's performance as Zuckerberg because they can kind of see the real-life public-facing persona of Zuckerberg and compare that to Jesse Eisenberg and their similarities. Whereas you can't do that with Andrew Garfield's character, so maybe some people don't always appreciate what he's able to bring, which is not one of trying to be just like Eduardo, the real-life person, because we don't know too much about him. He doesn't have a public-facing persona in the same way Mark Zuckerberg does. But what I love about his function within the story and what he brings as a character, as an actor, to the success of the film is bringing the tragedy, is bringing the heart, is bringing the emotion. Because Mark Zuckerberg as a character in this film is so steely and cold, And then you have Justin Timberlake's Sean Parker, which is slick and charming, but kind of slimy and unability to trust, untrustworthy, but also kind of cool and charming. Those two characters, which are so key to the film, don't have a lot of emotional register. So a lot of that falls back to Andrew Garfield's character. And what I think makes this movie more than just like a slick, entertaining biopic is some of those underlying themes of friendship, of betrayal, and that almost all comes through Garfield and his ability to deliver this performance. And this is still a younger Garfield. He wasn't a fully formed actor at this time, and yet it feels like that kind of performance. Watching it again, it's amazing to see some of these reaction shots from Garfield. And we think of the scene when they're at dinner, or when he's kind of reflecting on them at dinner. You have some instances in which he's recounting it in the courtroom and he's almost uncomfortable to be telling the story. You realize just how painful it is for him. And then you see the reaction shots of him, maybe not necessarily speaking up at the time, but clearly being uncomfortable with the situation. And you start to realize and appreciate, I think, Garfield's ability to communicate some of those feelings of dissatisfaction or betrayal or uncertainty. And how, the moral center of the film and maybe of the business was kind of faltering. And he was kind of trying to keep it in line and was ultimately splitting up aside from that. And you really see, I think, what he nails so much is the heartbreak of the loss of this friendship. I think a lot of people look at this film as a movie, in broad terms, talks about how Mark Zuckerberg couldn't get a girlfriend, so therefore he made Facebook, and that's his kind of form of social connection. And it's neat and it's cute, especially because the first and the last scenes emphasize that kind of female companionship. But I think that's more of a neat way to view the film. It's just because the first and the last scene have, particularly the Erica character, that makes it seem like a clear consensus and a clear point of view. But I think the real tragedy of the film is the breakup in friendship, not the breakup and revenge tour of a failed relationship. We don't really see the Erica character too much, really at all, throughout the entire film. The real kind of tragedy, I think, is not that Mark Zuckerberg created Facebook because he couldn't get a girl, but that Mark Zuckerberg created Facebook and about social connection, and yet he couldn't have social connection with his friend Eduardo, and his lack of ethics and morals within the story of the film, and how it kind of let it get away from him and wasn't nurturing them, and that maybe he wasn't this kind of great friend in the first place. And when you understand the events of the film and you see Garfield's character, particularly even early on, scenes in the dorm, you see his reaction shots, you see his face, you see the disappointment, the heartbreak, and he is really the emotional center of the film. And Garfield is able to bring a lot of that through not dialogue alone, but just through these two shots with him and Mark, or how he responds to something that Mark says. Sometimes in a movie that's so fast-paced, him taking a step back and being kind of stunned by what Mark just said, and his facial reactions gives so much and lends so much credibility to us understanding the tragedy of the story. At least that's how I see it. And going back and watching Garfield's performance, I was just amazed this time around at how skilled of an actor he was so early, and how integral he is to bringing the emotional heart and center of the film, because the other two characters are so distant or slick or not giving us that. So an excellent film, one of the iconic films of the 2010s, and my definite pick. Even amongst some amazing films, I love Inception, I love True Grit, still I would go with The Social Network. It's that good. But speaking about my alternative, unnominated pick, I went with MacGruber. And we're seeing a bit of a trend the past few episodes here where I'm really leaning into comedy. And I'm in part doing that because A, this year, I've actually, a lot of my favorite movies of the year were nominated for Best Picture, so there is a good number of overlap. And B, because it's an opportunity for us to talk about great comedies that would have never been qualified for the Oscars. MacGruber is such an odd, absurd movie, but it's still a very funny movie, a movie that is right down in my comedic sensibilities. It's also a movie that isn't on the same level, I think, in icon status as Anchorman or Superbad or Bridesmaids, but I put up right there as one of the funniest movies of the 21st century, at least for me. And what I love so much about it is Will Forte and his comedic sensibilities are direct and clear within this movie. Some movies like a Superbad, let's say, or Anchorman, they have great ensembles. You like all the different characters. Everyone gets a little bit of shine. But this movie with MacGruber It has a great cast for sure. I love Val Kilmer and Ryan Phillippe, but it is so direct within the sensibilities of its comedic star in Will Forte. It is a Will Forte vehicle. In the same way, The Jerk is a Steve Martin vehicle. In the same way, Mrs. Doubtfire is a Robin Williams vehicle. It feels so indebted to MacGruber and Will Forte and his deeply absurdist sensibilities, taking this MacGyver-esque character who solves things in only the ways that he knows how to defeat these evil baddies. And how does he solve these scenarios? It's by doing crazy, over-the-top, silly, deeply absurd humor. Forte totally commits to this character. I don't even think he thinks it's that funny when he's acting. He is totally bought into this macho action hero kind of persona. It's just the fact that he is a failure that does things in these odd, strange, very uncomfortable ways that makes it so much funnier. It's funny that MacGruber and Will Forte is connected to like the SNL era and someone like a Bill Hader or a Will Ferrell, but Will Forte I think almost has something more in common with like a Tim Robinson than he does a Will Ferrell in terms of those two different kind of generations of comedy. In that he actually takes this character very seriously, or when he's talking about his relationship with the villain, he has a genuine pathos and a seriousness, and he plays it so straight, which I think ultimately makes things so funnier because he's playing something that is deeply absurd, deeply silly, so straight, makes it that much funnier. And there's a sense of commitment that Forte brings to the character and totally understands the character of MacGruber so much that makes the movie that much funnier. So MacGruber is a movie, if you haven't seen, it is absolutely excellent. I put it right up there with some of the best comedies of the 2010s for sure. And it just makes me laugh every single time. I don't know if it's going to make you laugh. It's very specific. It's very absurdist. It's very oddball. But if you kind of get on that wavelength, it can be one of the funniest movies you've ever seen. At least that's what it is for me. And why not? Let's give him an Oscar nomination. It's one of my top 10 movies of the year. So why can't it be the Oscars? But now, just wrapping up things, we're trying to answer the question, did the Academy get it right? And I think the answer is ultimately no. The Social Network is undoubtedly the more popular film, the more critically acclaimed film. You have the fact that Aaron Sorkin and David Fincher, with the writer and director of the film, have gone on to make many other films that have been nominated for Oscars and are key creatives of working film today. You have the fact that The Social Network is a drama at the end of the day. And yet 15 years later, a sequel is being made based on the fact that this movie is still resonant and still popular. I think that's a huge sign that this movie probably should have won because it has actually stood the test of time. You're not going to see a King's Speech sequel anytime soon. And then the fact that Tom Hooper, not to rag on him, but his last movie was Cats, which was critically reviled, and that was 7 years ago. He hasn't made a film. I don't think he has a movie scheduled to be made anytime soon either. So his career, especially after winning King's Speech, kind of went in the dumps. And David Fincher is making some of the biggest movies of the year, in this case with The Adventures of Cliff Booth, still working at the top of his game. Same thing with Aaron Sorkin, making a huge Oscar play in The Social Reckoning. So going to be definitely a looking back on it, how did this ultimately lose situation. And I do think that maybe some people think The Social Network is overrated or whatnot, but it is without a doubt a very entertaining movie, very engaging movie that I think also has some really engaging and exciting themes that I love to return to time and time again. So it would have been my pick for Best Picture at the 2010 Oscars. But that's about it. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Make sure you let me know what your thoughts are on the video and also some of your favorite movies from 2010 in the Best Picture category, or if you want to make any changes to some of the other Best Actress or Acting categories. Love to hear that as well in the comments down below. But that's about it. Until next time, stay tuned.